So now we come on to the French Revolution. We've talked a little bit about the American Revolution and how that forces Britain into rethinking the way that it does its empire building, that it changes the way in which it responds to Americans. And so we have this wonderful, well, I guess, eventually a wonderful relationship between the British and the Americans that will bear fruit. But in the process of that revolution, the Americans become involved with the French. The French start funding the Americans and supporting the Americans, and this has consequences in France, and various things begin to go wrong in France in a cascading effect. And so we end up on July the 14th, after a long sort of series of events, which I don't really want to talk about, just to say that all of this builds up to the French Revolution, which starts on July the 14th, 1789, which is sort of the equivalent of the French Day of Independence, I suppose. That's how they count everything. So let me start. Oops, that's not the one I want. Let me show the screen I actually want, and I think it's going to be this one here. So what we've got is the French, and they are fed up after a series of failed harvests and some other bits and pieces, and they end up getting a French Revolution. And we're not really here to talk about the French Revolution. We're talking about what it actually means to the British. And the British initially greeted it with enthusiasm, largely. Charles Fox, who you might remember as the man who stood up in the House of Commons wearing an American revolutionary military outfit, he said how much the greatest event it is that ever happened in the world, and how much the best. It was a very curious thing for a British person to say about the French, because the French and the English have never gotten along. I have a wonderful book called 1000 Years of Annoying the French, which I think kind of typifies the general British reaction to French people. Anyway, what happens is the French revolt, and the British kind of go, well, this is actually kind of a good thing. Richard Price, here he is here. He's a Unitarian and a political commentator and a radical. And there's quite a few of these at the time. He says, or rather in November, so this is just a little while afterwards, he preaches a sermon commemorating the glorious revolution of 1688. Fair enough, that's a British thing. But then he concluded by saying that what's happening in France is the dawn of a new era. And he says this is the quote: "Behold, all you friends of freedom, behold the light that you have struck out. After setting America free, reflected to France, there kindled into a blaze that lays despotism in ashes and warms and illuminates Europe. I see the yarder for liberty catching and spreading, the dominions of kings changed for the dominions of laws, and the dominion of priests giving way to the dominion of reason and conscience." A fairly sort of crazy thing to say in a way. He said some other bits and pieces here, and I'll leave the slide there as I leave it up there, because it's very annoying to read slides out for people, so you can have a look. But I do like the first section where he says, on the first point, he says, "I'm going to make a change for once in my life." I think it's just a very modern thing to say, but I think it's great. But this is sort of fairly typical of those kinds of things. There are lots of radicals in Britain who love what the French have done, and they begin to respond to it by creating associations. They produce leaflets. There are newspapers, all done in response to all of this. And I think that's a sign of an appetite for a change in the way that things have sort of been done in Britain. And fair enough. But it is important to note that not everybody thought about this in the same way. And when you get to, I've forgotten which chapter it is in your Sources and Debates book, but you will come across this man, Edmund Burke, who is a conservative commentator. And he wrote a series of articles, reflections on the revolution. Perhaps he was initially actually quite enthusiastic about it, and then ended up sort of changing his mind and thinking that, well, maybe it isn't actually as good as I thought it was. And for good reasons, because the French started out saying, yes, we can have all this liberty, and then they started killing people, mostly the upper classes, in quite a large number. through Madame Guillotine. And Madame Guillotine was then eventually turned against the French people themselves, not just the upper class, but they actually turned against the radicals in France. So it was a big mess. Then he has this big sort of ongoing argument with Thomas Paine, which we'll read about, and we'll talk about in class when we get there. But in his reflections on the revolutions of France, which you can sort of see here in 1790, he predicted that the revolution would be contagious, destructive, and would breed tyranny and terror, and that's exactly what it ended up doing. He had originally overstated the old regime, which is the previous government, if you like, the government of the aristocrats. And so he was and is, I still think today, sort of a quintessential conservative. Excuse me. His reflections was the first, the thing he wrote was the first, I guess, text to criticize of what he saw as the, quote, bad men in action. And his major points are really about, he's very concerned with stability and tradition. He doesn't believe that rebellion is the way to solve the problems that you have. In other words, he's pushing for a gradual change in society, not a destructive and violent and quick change in society. So you work within the system organically, not radically. So it's reform, not revolution. And he had, and as you read, you'll find that he has tremendous, what's the word? Admiration for the monarchy and for the aristocratic values, which is what he calls the old order. And he thinks of the sort of the lower class people as the swinish multitude. The French revolutionaries were nothing more than savages to him, and in many ways they kind of were. So he's not completely without fault here. When the Paris mob attacked the Palace of Versailles in October 1789, he was incensed that the king and queen should be treated in such a way. And he wrote a famous passage on the attack of the queen, which actually never happened in the way suggested, but for him it was symbolic. It was the overturning of everything which he held dear. And so Burke is the conservative voice. I'm not going to pass judgment on him because my mind changes on him as I get older. Before I thought he was ridiculous, but now I think he actually might be onto something. But nonetheless, this is Edmund Burke, and again, he is a fairly one of the most important voices during this time period. But not everybody agrees with Burke, and here is Mary Wollstonecraft, who is famous for a number of different reasons, and you can look those up. She begins to argue back against him. So again, you can read the text here. But Wollstonecraft's response to Burke is based upon an argument in which it asserts rights for all classes of men, and it decries hierarchy in all of its forms, which I think is probably a defining element of liberalism and progressivism even today. If you look at the progressive and the hyper-progressive movements that are going around right now, they are largely against hierarchy, and any difference between two peoples is a sign of oppression and power. I guess this kind of wanders us into the Marxist-Leninist territories, but I don't really want to get into that. But she's particularly, she's incensed by Burke's ignoring of the suffering of the working classes and the deprivation of the working classes, which is caused by the old order. So in other words, the old order is responsible for much of this, but fails to alleviate anything that they could have done. So she complains about the treatment of soldiers and sailors, press gangs. Once upon a time, if you were walking down the street at night, you could be pressed into service. In other words, you'd essentially be kidnapped for the service of the state, and they'd stick you on a ship, and you'd have to be a sailor or whatever it was, or a soldier. And so these are all sort of ideas that she thinks are terrible things, which Burke fails to address and fails to talk about. And of course, Thomas Paine, who we have talked about before, he is I don't know. We'll look at him in class. I don't really want to go over him here, but he is quite diametrically opposed, and his attacks to Burke are diametrically opposed. We'll read about it because he talks about the corruption of the monarchical systems. He attacks the whole idea of rank and aristocracy, and where you sit in response to his arguments kind of tells you whether you're a conservative or a liberal, I guess. He also gives some very practical suggestions about how to have an egalitarian society, or how an egalitarian society might function. And I think it's probably important to think about this, and we'll talk about this, hopefully, if I remember, when we get to the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment comes out of a stream of thinking about the perfectibility of man. I don't know if you remember, I'll actually go back to Richard Price's thing here. If you look at the last bullet point there, he is arguing for the doctrine of perfectibility. The other words, we can make heaven on earth. And this is a very common theme amongst many people. And what's kind of interesting about all of them is that they generally tend not to be Christian. I know it does say he's a Unitarian minister, but Unitarians are not considered to be kosher Christians. They're not Orthodox. And this is something that's quite common amongst many of the people during this time period, is that they think that we can make things better. All we have to do is educate people. This is essentially the liberal idea. If you educate people, they'll become better people. And then we will get rid of the ills in society. The conservative argument is largely that the ills in society are actually rooted in the person, whereas liberals tend to argue that the evils in society are rooted in the structures, which I think is a Marxist idea. But anyway, I don't want to get too much into that side. So Paine has a response to this. And there are, as I said, many English responses to it, all the way up and down Britain. And really what it comes down to is that why didn't Britain end up with a French Revolution of their own? Now, part of it is that we did have our own civil war, and we've had one sort of 60 years earlier. So it's about a little bit more actually now, maybe 100 years earlier. And nobody really wants to do that again. As I said, the British tend to define themselves in reference to the people around them. And other people are doing these revolutions. And these revolutions will actually continue for the next sort of 50 odd years, into the 1850s, well, sort of late 1840s. Other people in Europe will be having revolutions, and the Prussians in what is modern day Germany. And there's various French things happening. And the reason is why? Why did we not have one? I think part of it is due to Burke's idea of gradual change rather than sort of crazy change. We don't want a revolution to happen because it destroys everything. I once heard, I think it's Mary Harrington, who you should look up sometime. She's a fascinating sort of new wave of feminism, I suppose. And she very often gives the idea of, if you come across a field and there's a fence or a gate in it, liberals will destroy the gates to get rid of it, whereas conservatives will say, well, why is the gate here? And I think that sort of shows two different attitudes towards what's going on. And I think you can see this all the way back here. The progressives of the time wanted to destroy everything and restart. But the conservatives said, no, we should do this slowly. And again, I don't think it's possible to really pass judgment on this, whether this is a good idea or a bad idea. Simply to say that they end up with different consequences and they start from different starting points, obviously. And it really depends on where you feel you stand. Do you stand in well, there's a problem in the world and we can fix the world, or is it a problem in people and therefore we need to sort of fix the people? Anyway, so back to Britain. Nobody's having these revolutions in Britain because we are gradualists. We are not excitable. One of the things is that popular opinion becomes quite important. What we begin to see is, as it says there in the third bullet point, loyalists and radicalists, they begin to organize. these groups begin to get, and I don't want to go into too much detail because it kind of pushes us out of the purview of what we want to talk about. But both radicalists and loyalists, for very different reasons, begin to organize on a mass scale, and they start printing, they start organizing. They have newspapers, they have pamphlets, they have organizations that get together all over the UK. And then, if you get a loyalist group that pops up, then you'll have a reformist group that pops up, or a radical group that pops up in response. And so you end up with this tension running throughout the entire country. And what this is kind of the too long didn't read version, but what this really boils down to is all of this begins to lead to reform. Now, why this happens, I mean, you could be cynical about this and say, well, we start out with reform because the consequences would be the French Revolution if we didn't. So the upper classes engage in reform to make sure that they keep their heads on. And there might be some truth in that. But what the reform that we do have, and it starts around 1807, and it starts with the parliamentarians, obviously. It's not going to be a monarchist thing, which is kind of interesting. But instead of following Paine, and Paine has this very radical way of trying to do stuff, they eschew that for a much more constitutionalist idiom, arguing that there should be a restoration of the proper balances between the Crown, the Lords, and the Commons. And this is kind of interesting, is that many of the arguments that we've had throughout history in England are largely about we need to return things to how they used to be. It's never really arguing for new rights. It's generally saying, hey, this is how proper rights should be restored because they've been abrogated by the Crown or by the King or whatever. You go back to something like the Magna Carta in 1215, when the barons sort of get together and they say, right, the king needs to start paying properly like he should be, and here's how he should be operating, which kind of implies that he's not. So it's not saying give us more power or we want something back. It's like, no, this is how things used to be. And so I think this is part of what happens in 1807. They begin to attack the corruption that they see in the government. William Cobbett, who was I guess, a populist spokesperson for all of this, denounced the use of royal pensions to buy political allegiance. In other words, the king would give people money, and those people would obviously vote for his particular concerns. And he attacked that. He attacked the incompetence, as we are currently in a war at the moment, the Napoleonic War. And inefficiency in the state finances. These are all sort of like modern concerns in a way. And so what we end up with really is limited electoral reform. So this is sort of essentially conceded by 1832. Now, universal suffrage will take another 100 years until 1928, but I think it's finally women are allowed to vote. But this is a very slow process. Somebody once said that this might be attributed to the resilience of the British political elite, or perhaps the weakness of the political opposition, or the failures of these reform movements. But the French Revolution is a large factor in all of this. You've got to remember France is right next door to Britain. They can see, well, I can't see, but they can hear everything that's going on, and everything is reported. And so they are seeing what happens when you have a radical and sort of destructive revolution. These are the consequences. So when you look at British liberal writing before the French Revolution, it tends to talk about the excessive powers of the crown. In other words, the king may be the person who is taking away your rights, or maybe trampling on your rights. And this is, if you go back to the 1600s and the whole arguments that are running around then up into the Glorious Revolution, this is it. The king is taking too much. He is misusing his powers, and therefore we are all suffering as a result of it. So up until then, that's what people talk about. But after the French Revolution, I think both sides, both the conservative and the liberal sides tend to see it's the people who threaten liberty. They are the ones who are most likely to cause problems. And you can see this with the again, looking at the French Revolution, it's if you like, the masses, to use a phrase, it's the masses who are causing all of these problems. And so the political elites are actually very worried about this, and quite rightly too. And they do not think, or they don't think that people could be trusted to exercise their democratic rights properly. And it's fascinating, actually, to listen to some of the American politics going on at the moment, where at least several people have argued that the voting age should be raised to 21, because young people don't know how to vote properly and stuff like this. And it's really just to conserve power within the American right. And it's kind of interesting that the English right at this point are kind of doing the same thing. So the elite don't think people can be trusted, yet at the same time, it's really important that if you antagonize the people, and I always tell my students never to use the word or the phrase the people, because it doesn't really describe anything, but essentially anybody who's not political elite in this case, anybody who those you have to maintain the loyalty of the masses, of the people, because otherwise you'll end up with a French Revolution like that, and then you may end up on the sharp end of the pointy stick. So from the end of the French Revolution, what we begin to see is an attempt to sort of give people a certain measure of power, but kind of denying it at the same time. So there is electoral reform. Males begin to have the vote up to a certain sort of point. But at the same time, there is a vast propaganda movement to bolster the idea of a popular monarchy, and to really show people that while they might be given a certain measure of power, at the same time, that measure of power is limited and not necessarily wide-reaching. It certainly wasn't. But what it does is it acts a bit. If you think of a pressure cooker, you've got a pressure cooker and you've got all sorts of stuff inside, and the pressure is building up. You need some sort of release valve. Well, the electoral reforms are the release valve for Britain. It stops both loyalists and radicalists from creating any sort of overwhelming movement by releasing steam. So instead of people going into the streets and causing problems, they can go into the voting booths and cause problems there instead, which of course is a much more civilized way of doing it. It's a much slower way of doing it. People are denied certain democratic rights, assuming that people should have democratic rights, and that's a whole other argument. But at least they are given a chance, or at least the illusion of a chance, depending on how you want to look at it, that they can actually change something. So that's really why we end up with the French Revolution. Sorry, that's why we don't end up with the French Revolution, is because the British chose essentially a conservative route, having looked at the consequences of the French Revolutions, and also having lived through the American Revolution, which admittedly didn't really impact everybody so in such a direct way. The French Revolution did that in a much more tangible fashion. But nobody really wants to go to war. Plus, they're in the middle of a war at the moment, and that creates other tensions. Fighting Napoleon is not helpful. It creates issues for them to do with taxation, and obviously people dying and coming back from the war wounded and destroyed doesn't really help either. So that's where we end up. We have two revolutions, both sort of feed into each other, but also feed back into England and the responses of England to various stresses that are floating around at that moment. So that's what we have, two revolutions and the British response to them. And we'll talk a little bit, I think, next time, if I've got my timing right, about how the Enlightenment, which feeds into a lot of the French and American revolutions, how this changes the way that people think as well. Because it's not just democratic movements, it's also philosophical movements and thoughts which change the way that people operate and think about the world. And that has obviously its own consequences on what's happening in Britain and elsewhere.